Hello, everyone. I'm Ellie Wang from Taiwan. Okay, so everybody hear me. Okay, so it's my pleasure to participate in this discussion. Thank you, Song and sorry. Thank you, Song Moon and Yong Sam, for your invitation and arrangements. Due to the time limit, I will read a shortened version of my commentary. It is always a delight to see contemporary engagement with the rich insights of Mencius and Xunziye. In the case of Kim's thoughtful and ambitious book, this delight is further accompanied with a feeling of inspiration about future possibilities. Indeed, the analytic style and the conceptual devices Kim adopts in his discussion and reconstruction of these two thinkers' ideas provide us a more focused and structured way to notice and appreciate their commonalities and differences. Moreover, he attends to the differences in the social and political contexts these two thinkers were embedded in, as well as their different views regarding human nature and moral psychology. This attention is then followed by his careful consideration about how much differences may influence the development of their respective views. This helps us achieve a more nuanced understanding of how these two thinkers responded to their time. It is from this structured appreciation and nuanced understanding of Mencius and Xunziye's thought that Kim aims to derive a cogent and systematic Confucian political theory. The cross-cultural comparative work in this book also adds much insight and enriches the discussion. This is surely a project that will initiate meaningful dialogues in Chinese political philosophy and political philosophy in general. So Kim first summarizes the four guiding ideas Mencius and Xunziye share, the paradigm of Confucian virtue politics. He then argues that beyond this shared paradigm, they parted company and developed two different models. Kim employs four conceptual frameworks to capture the difference between these two models. He also cautions us that these conceptual devices are often used as a heuristic, and the distinction are not mutually exclusive. However, the use of conceptual devices always comes at a risk. As Taoists have reminded us, any naming or distinction made splits or harms the object, or at least affects the way we perceive the object. Of course, as mentioned earlier, I find the employment of conceptual devices helpful. However, when our analysis is structured in a certain way, certain material is bound to be dismissed, and other interpretations and factors may not come into view. For the purpose of a better intellectual understanding, the employment of conceptual devices seems a necessary evil, but it should always be remembered that these devices are enabling and constraining at the same time. Clearly, Kim is aware of this risk when he puts in the cautionary notes. What I want to do in this commentary is to examine whether we can do more to further reduce the risk. Since, as Kim points out, Mencius and Xunziye share the paradigm of Confucian virtue politics, one may ask, why does Kim reconstruct their political thought as two different models? It is true that they have different views about human nature, and they respond to different political contexts. However, one may wonder whether those factors really lead their political thought in different directions. Are their different emphases really so pronounced that one cannot see them as a continuous whole? Here, I hope to point to ways in which Mencius and Xunziye's thought are indeed significantly continuous, despite their apparent differences in emphasis. The distinction between negative and positive Confucianism, according to Kim, lies in what it aims to do with the ruler's power, to constrain it or to enable it under proper constraint. These two positions are not polar opposite, and the distinction is really between whether there is enabling involved and possibly how the power is constrained or enabled. Kim argues that Mencius is drawn more strongly to negative Confucianism, while Xunziye is better associated with positive Confucianism. I find Kim's discussion of the positive political functions of ritual in Xunziye's view very helpful, and it is certainly in line with Xunziye's special emphasis on ritual and its relation with human nature. I also agree with Kim that in both Mencius and Xunziye's account, ritual institutions put negative constraints on rulers' power. However, Kim's discussion of the positive aspect of Mencius' view is puzzling to me. In his view, Mencius' talk about extending the ruler's private interest into general public interest may also count as positive Confucianism. However, Kim argues that there is a lack of motive of the ruler to become moral and a lack of a better depiction of how the ruler transforms. I argue that Mencius indeed offers some relevant answers, that his positive Confucianism should still be taken seriously, and that there is important continuity between the two thinkers' views. So, what is the motive for the ruler to be concerned with his subjects' well-being? Kim argues that this is not a problem for Xunzi, since according to Xunzi, even sage kings is still motivated by self-interest. However, we can see that self-interest is also what Mencius resorts to in the dialogues. Kim seems to recognize this and explains that what Mencius does is extending the ruler's private interest to the people. That may be one way to capture what Mencius is doing in some of the dialogues. However, in many cases, there is no real extending or transformation involved. Rather, what Mencius does is more like correcting or redirecting the ruler's way of thinking so that he can see how he may really get what he wants. For example, in the Hebi Yue Li passage, Mencius' point is that if the ruler's sole concern is with how one gains profit, superiors and inferiors will try to snatch profit from one another, and the kingdom will be endangered, and then there is no profit to be gained. While if one has Ren and Yi in mind, this will not happen. In the Snow Palace passage, Mencius clearly points out that when a ruler rejoices in the joy of his people, they also rejoice in his joy. In such a state of things, it cannot be but that the ruler be the ruler of the world. It is clear that the interlocutor with Mencius in this dialogue, King Xuan of Qi, is very interested in becoming ruler of the world, since he has several conversations with Mencius about how one becomes one and keeps the world. What Mencius does in these dialogues is explaining to the ruler that if he wants to achieve his own goal, gaining profit, becoming ruler of the world, he should have Ren and Yi in mind and practice good government. These passages provide the motive for the ruler to be concerned with his subjects' well-being. It is not just in line with his own goal, but it is the real way to achieve his own goal. What the ruler lacks when he makes bad decisions, according to Mencius, is not the capacity to extend his care for the people or to tell right from wrong. Rather, it is proper thinking with his mind. The problem is thus not with the ruler's desire for profit. Rather, it is with the ruler's way of thinking. Notice that the idea that people make morally bad decisions due to ignorance also plays an important part in the Xunzi. We also notice that as the ministers advise the ruler to have Ren and Yi in mind, they are constraining and enabling his power at the same time. It is clear that they are constraining his arbitrary use of power. However, they are also showing him how he may make his rule legitimate and effective, and maybe even win over the world by having Ren and Yi in mind and practicing good government. This is how, in Mencius' account, the ruler may be transformed. Moreover, for Mencius, ritual institutions, in fact, also play the enabling role. Generally speaking, it seems reasonable to think that for ritual, as for any naming and distinction-making, constraining and enabling work at the same time. Indeed, the reason why ritual constrains the ruler's power should also work to enable it, if the ruler satisfies the requirement. 1b5 and 4b3 are also pertinent to this issue. In 1b5, the discussion is about whether King Xuan of Qi should take down the Ming Hall. The Ming Hall used to be the place where the Son of Heaven in the Western Zhou practiced ritual, and it had been illegitimately occupied. Mencius' reason against King Xuan of Qi's taking Ming Hall down is because he knows of its symbolic power in ritual practices. If King Xuan of Qi is willing to practice good government, he will have a chance to rule the world, and this symbol in ritual will be appropriate for him. Practicing ritual in that hall then will further establish his legitimacy and authority. Thus, in this case, Mencius is at least tacitly affirming the enabling aspect of ritual institution. In 4b3, Mencius explicitly states that the ruler only earns the returning ritualistic respect from the minister if he himself practices 3 rituals. This again shows that for Mencius, ritual practices enables one's power by establishing and maintaining one's place in relationships. Notice that for Mencius, it is also through ritual practices that one can follow and manifest virtue. In the debate about the internality of yi, the examples used all regard ritual practices. Indeed, for Mencius, ritual practices are tightly connected with virtue. He said, yi is the way and ritual is the door. I hope I have provided some good reasons to take Mencius' approach to positive Confucianism seriously. Now I move on to comment on some other related issues. Kim employs another conceptual framework, virtue and ritual constitutionalism, to distinguish Mencius and Xunzi's political thought. According to Kim, Xunzi rejects the abdication legend, even though Mencius idealizes it. And this difference in attitude is attributable to their different forms of constitutionalism. The abdication legend relies too much on the king's virtuous charisma, and thus Xunzi rejects it due to his belief in institutions and political stability, and affirms hereditary royal transmission instead. Here I only focus on the rationale in Mencius' defense of the first hereditary royal transmission between Yu and Qi. In this incident, Mencius' defense is that Qi, as a man of talent and virtue, was able to reverently pursue Yu's Dao, while Yi assisted Yu only for a few years and had not long conferred benefits on the people. In this passage, Mencius' concern is not really just about virtue, and there is no reason for us to think that Yi is less virtuous than Qi. The reason why Qi is the chosen one is because of factors Qi had no control over. He assisted Yu for long, had conferred benefits on the people, and most importantly for my purpose here, he could reverently continue Yu's Dao. Understandably, it is because Qi assisted Yu for long that he could know the essence of Yu's wisdom in governing and following it. Indeed, for Mencius, the most important thing in political transmission is not necessarily the virtues of the persons involved, rather the continuation of a reasonably good government and political institutional stability matter more. Thus, according to Mencius, quote, when the kingdom is possessed by natural succession, the sovereign who is displaced by heaven must be like Jie or Zhou, end quote. The so-called abdication is only an exception and thus needs to meet an exceptionally rigid criterion. Quote, in the case of private individual obtaining the throne, there must be in him virtue equal to that of Shun and or Yu. And moreover, there must be the presenting of him to heaven by the preceding sovereign, end quote. Again, Xunzi's concern for the dynasty's uninterruptibility and unchangeability in fact echoes Mencius' position. It is also pertinent to bring up the distinction Wang Ba here. Kim noticed Mencius' positive evaluations of Ba, but he finds them in deep tension with Mencius' normative political dualism, which identifies whichever government that is not Ren with a tyrannical government. One passage Kim uses to support this identity is 2A1. Based on this passage, Kim takes Mencius to identify Qi, one Ba government at his time, with a tyrannical government. However, the point of the latter half of 2A1 is to state that King Xuan of Qi had a favorable opportunity, Shi, over King Wen to become the ruler of the world, even though he's not as virtuous. Shi refers to factors attributed to external conditions, not under one's control. In Qi's case, the Shi that was favorable to the ruler was the fact that Qi had many more resources. Moreover, quote, never was there a time farther removed than the present from the rise of the true sovereign. Never was there a time when the sufferings of the people from the tyrannical government were more intense than the present. The hungry readily partake of any food and the thirsty of any drink, end quote. Notice that this mention of tyrannical government is in the context of listing the favorable shi for the ruler of Qi to become the ruler of the world. The situation was favorable for him because people's suffering had been unusually intense, so they would take anything that was acceptable. And according to Mencius, what would be acceptable and could move people to support the ruler of Qi was his adoption of Zhen government. Since the conversation is about becoming ruler of the world, the suffering mentioned in this passage is a general phenomenon and not specific to the people of Qi. Moreover, Mencius never describes the government of Qi as tyrannical, though he did say Qi's competitor, Yan, was tyrannizing over his people. And this is, in fact, his justification for the ruler of Qi's attacking and punishing Yan. There is thus good reason to think that Mencius mainly had Yan in mind when he talked about tyrannical government in 2A1, not Qi. When we reconsider 2A1, we find that for Mencius, not a not perfectly virtuous ruler can still adopt Zhen government. This is not surprising. In both 1A5 and 1B5, Mencius provides pretty detailed accounts of Zhen government, and neither of them requires a completely virtuous ruler or aims at making people completely virtuous. They're both about helping people live a sufficient, harmonious, and ordered life. Considering this, and Mencius' preference for political stability and continuity of an acceptable government over mere virtue, maybe Mencius is not an extreme idealist after all, but maybe a tempered virtue monist like Xunzi. Another related issue is the relation between the ruler and the minister. According to Kim, due to Mencius' virtue constitutionalism, he has to resort to the virtue of sage ministers to constrain the ruler's arbitrary use of power. The relationship between Tang and Yi counts as one example. Kim argues that Xunziye has a notion of indivisibility of sovereign power, which is very different from Mencius' political ideal. Here again, I will not engage Kim full argument, but only to mention that, in fact, Xunzi also finds the relationship between Tang and Yi ideal. Moreover, Xunzi says that people who remonstrate, wrangle, assist, and oppose the ruler are, quote, true ministers of altars of soil and grain, end quote, the real treasures of the country and its lord, and Yi is mentioned as one example of such people. He went on as far as writing that one should follow the way and not follow the Lord, to express his point. Indeed, Xunzi in fact support division of labor and power in politics. In his view, since rulers cannot do everything themselves, they should find ministers that can be fully entrusted with responsibility, with the virtue that can comfort the people, and the knowledge that is sufficient to respond to the myriad changes. Surely, these comments do not necessarily challenge the idea that Xunzi upholds the indivisibility of sovereign power, depending on what that means. However, considering what Xunzi says about Yi and the importance he sees in sage ministers, it seems safe to think that there is again strong continuity between Mencius and Xunzi's political views. To Xunzi, good ritual institutions are crucial, so are the virtues of the ruler and the minister. After all, there is no institution that can produce order by itself. I hope I have shown that there are significant continuities between Mencius and Xunzi's thought. It would be interesting to see if such continuities can be derived from the paradigm of Confucian virtue politics Kim proposes, or whether they may add something to the paradigm and make it thicker than the four propositions Kim recognizes. Either way, we may have reason to think that Xunzi's political view is better seen as a development from that of Mencius, instead of seeing them as two distinct models. In fact, it is likely that Xunzi's political view is not only a development from that of Mencius, but also from the political views of his contemporaries. For example, as I mentioned earlier, even though Mencius recognized the role ritual plays in coordinating interpersonal relations and the following of the way, It is Xunzi's special attention to the distinction-making, fen, that lays the foundation of his systematic analysis and emphasis on ritual. Masayuki Sato has argued that Xunzi's attention to fen and his later philosophical development may be influenced by Jixia scholars such as Shen Dao and Guanzi. Context matters when it comes to understanding the text. Kim has reminded us of this by carefully recognizing that the texts in the Mencius and the Xunzi are often their conversations with kings and ministers, and that their thoughts are responding to their own social and political situation, the increasing threat of realpolitik. It would be helpful for us to have a better grasp of their thoughts, I think, if we can also consider the influence they get from their contemporaries, the inspirations, and the challenges. In the end, maybe the choice between seeing Xunzi's thought as continuously developing from that of Mencius and others, and seeing them as two distinct models itself is a false dichotomy, as long as we have structured and also nuanced understanding of them. The rich insights in Kim's book definitely provide us with a good start. Thank you.